Hey guys, thank you for coming. My name is Robert Rounsavall with a company called Trapezoid, and I'll give you a little background. And then what we're going to chat about today is device integrity. I'm a former Navy cryptologic technician chief, and I was attached to the NSA. And prior to Trapezoid, I was at a company called Terramark down in South Florida, and we worked a lot of data breach incidents, probably 80 to 120 data breach incidents a year. Biggest one I personally worked on, I get a call from my boss. He says, "Hey, it's Saturday. He says, show up at the airport tomorrow, pack your bag for 10 days, and I'll tell you where we're going when we get there." And so I pack, I roll, and we fly up to Chicago. We go to the FBI field office, meet with the special agent in charge of cyber. And it was the 2008 Obama campaign. So it was Obama, McCain, and the DNC all got compromised by a nation-state actor. We actually responded on site. And this is August, and my team monitored that network from August through the election. And no matter where you are politically, it was a great experience. And a lot of the incidents we worked like that were all large-scale data breach incidents. In 2015, Mike Lizikoff did a big expose with attribution to who all was working on that incident stuff. When I come at this problem, it's with a background in incident response. So typically, when you deal with a cyber incident, I always felt like, okay, if I've got an incident, there's 4 things I need. One, I need access to network traffic. And network traffic could be in the form of NetFlow data. It could be full packet capture. That's really one of the only ways you can see what's coming in and out of your network, where things are moving laterally, is by looking at the network traffic. Second thing you need for an incident is access to disk. And we'd use tools like Forensic Toolkit, DD, and we had an incident where a defense contractor sent classified information, and disk tools, they build a nice timeline so you can see what people are doing when. So you want to get access. This is all about data access. You want to get access to data. The third thing you need access to is memory. So a lot of the attack tools, they're running in memory these days. I've been out of the IR game for a while, but from time to time get pulled back in. I was just on an incident at the end of last year. It was a big ransomware incident, and the way they got in was they sent a phishing email, executed a tool called Mimikatz that ran in memory, got the passwords, then the bad guys got in, used their own user credentials to do all their bad stuff. The other thing you need is access to logs. So if you're in a large environment, systems generate logs. You use tools like Splunk. You use tools like ArcSight, or if you looked around, Logarithm was out there on the trade show floor. So any of those tools capture data. I always felt like, okay, if I've got access to those things, I can solve for just about any incident. And what would happen a lot to us is, you roll on an incident. The going rate for IR these days, even for junior folks, is $450 an hour plus. So if you got 4 or 5 guys rolling on an incident, and sometimes it's 24 hours before you have a smart guy looking at packets and stuff, and customers will be 30, 40, 50 grand into an incident before any analysis has taken place. And it's very common. So if you have these 4 things, the thing I'd add these days with all the ransomware and stuff is have these things, but also have backups, because backups are becoming cool again, because if you don't have backups, you're gonna have big problems. And both of the big ransomware incidents I was just on, they wiped everything, including the backups, and they just didn't check. They eventually found some backups and got up and running, but a lot of times you're in a full recovery situation. So again, I always felt like those are the things you need for an incident. But what happens if you don't have, what happens if the incident is not occurring on disk, memory, logs, whatever? What happens if it's down at the firmware? And firmware is the code. And by the way, feel free to stop me, ask questions at any time. But firmware is this code that sits on the board in between the operating system and the hardware. So you've got the OS running on the hard drive. Firmware could be BIOS. It could be your network and RAID cards. They all have firmware. And now smaller IoT devices, the whole operating system is in firmware. So the incident could be in firmware, but what if there's a hardware issue? And kind of what happened there is I was at this company doing a lot of incident response. We made a couple of acquisitions, and I was put in charge of building out the Security Operations Center. 2009, I'm walking through one of our data centers with some federal customers, and we had built all of those 4 capabilities onto our cloud platform. And these federal folks, they're like, wow, you know, this is really great. What you're doing is really far ahead. But what happens if stuff arrives on your loading dock and it's already compromised? You know, like you throw out the hard drive and it's, you put in a new hard drive, you reload the operating system, and it's still compromised. Well, I had no idea. It's like, okay, they were talking about firmware attacks. They were talking about potential hardware modifications. And so what we did at the time was we did 2 things. The only 2 things you could do are, one, we bought TAA compliant equipment. And essentially what that means is it's manufactured in one place, and it's assembled somewhere hopefully more friendly to our federal government customers. Now, when you talk to federal government customers these days, they're like, well, that really doesn't mean much. But the other thing we did was we really tightened down our procurement and deployment practices. So our first cloud platform that we were doing things with was HP. Then we moved to Cisco, UCS. And what we did was anytime we deployed a system, we would download all of the firmware we could from the manufacturer. We'd update the BIOS. We'd update the RAID card. We'd update the network cards on every system that we pushed out. So what that would do is hopefully reduce the risk of something in the supply chain. And I'll give you a quick timeline. If you've been paying attention to the space, there's a lot that I've skipped. There's a lot of research going on right now. But from a firmware attack back in 1998, there was this thing called the Chernobyl virus, and that got into the BIOS of systems. It caused, I think, $250 million worth of damage or whatever. And it was a big deal because you had to physically either replace the BIOS chip at the time or get in there and flash the BIOS somehow. So it was the first, one of the first instances of an actual firmware attack out in the wild. The next one, in 2010, fast forward to 2010, and Dell had an issue that you can still see online where they were shipping replacement system boards. So what happens, you've got a data center full of Dell servers, the system board breaks, and you call Dell support, they do the troubleshooting, they say, yes, your system board's broken, we're gonna ship you a new one. Well, that new system board doesn't necessarily come right from Dell, it comes from one of their supply chain partners. And what was happening was you get the new system board, you put it in your server, you fire up the server, you hit F3 to go into diagnostics, and there was some malware that ran, and now your network's infected from the system board straight from the manufacturer. So that was in 2010. Fast forward again to 2014. 2 things happened. One was the leak of the NSA ANT catalog, the whole Edward Snowden thing. And if you've been in security for a while, every security vendor was going, oh, we can stop we could have prevented the Edward Snowden leaks with our whatever device it was. So there was a lot of noise around that. But what was interesting to us was that in that data dump, there was about 40 documents, and they are product slicks from the NSA about capabilities that dealt with firmware. So there were server attacks where you could replace the hard drive. There were routers and switches you can replace, survive a reboot, survive hardware replacement. And so what that meant basically was that there were these firmware attacks available to our federal government. They were using them for whatever they used them for. But that happened in 2014. If you look at the date on those product slicks that got released, it was the dates on those papers were between 2007 and 2008. So there were capabilities in 2008 to do firmware attacks on our side. And what happened was, it was 2009 when the federal government was asking me, they're like, hey, what happens when this stuff happens? And I didn't really start tying it together until that time. The next thing that happened, NIST 853, who in here works in the federal space? Government contracting, anything? Okay, so you probably had to deal with NIST at some point. When they did Rev 4, they added a bunch of sections. They added some things on firmware. The section SI7 is all about firmware, and they actually changed the wording from hardware software to hardware software and firmware, but they made it a hard requirement. So if you look in SI7, there's 16 controls. The first one says the organization has a tool to detect unauthorized changes in firmware. So in 2014, it was recognized that this might be an issue. Then in 2015, there was another data breach. There was this group called the Hacking Team. I believe they were an Israeli company, and they were compromised, and they leaked a bunch of documentation, including some firmware attacks and offensive capabilities. What was interesting about the Hacking Team data breach is that the person who did it was an activist who was mad that this company was helping the government, and they wrote they wrote specifically everything they did to attack the network, and they actually wrote a firmware exploit to get in, but once they were inside, it basically looked like your Certified Ethical Hacking 101 course. It was all the basic tools. It was nothing crazy, but in that breach, there was some firmware capabilities. This is the last one for the timeline. So at the very end of last year, ESET put out some research where they said, hey, we found out in the wild firmware rootkits. And what's interesting about that is those firmware rootkits used tools that were leaked from the Hacking Team data breach. So what you've got is from 1998 till today, this is kind of high level, and it's shaped where we've gone from a firmware security perspective. So essentially, there's three ways that these attacks are happening, or these attacks are being discovered. You got stuff in the wild, like the Chernobyl virus and the Fancy Bear stuff. There's stuff in the wild. The other way is there's research. So at Black Hat, DEF CON, and all that, there's a bunch of people now doing talks of firmware security research and things like that. And then the final thing is these unauthorized government disclosures. And when that happens, I call them the bad guys, the adversaries, they're using all of these tools that are getting disclosed to come back and attack companies and attack us. So this is kind of how things started from a firmware perspective. And so we always felt like you can't trust your software if you can't trust the underlying hardware. So that's the problem we've been trying to solve over the last several years. Most of the other security tools, they sit up higher in the stack. They're looking at the network traffic, the disk, et cetera. You're just starting to see things down at the firmware BIOS level. Caveat, we have a tool that looks at that stuff, but that's not what this is about. So how do you assess the integrity of a device? So you've got the four things you need for incident response. What if you have things in firmware? The first thing you need to look at is hardware, and by hardware, I mean we want to take an inventory of the hardware. If you're looking at a server, a router, or a switch, we want to know everything that's connected to the system board. We want to know everything that's connected to the system board. We want to know all the serial numbers. We want a bill of materials, and we want to get everything we can about that hardware, because if something changes, we want to know. How's it going, sir?
Very good.
Good. Thanks for coming by. If something changes, we want to know what's going on. So if somebody replaces a power supply, if somebody replaces a network card, that could be an indicator of compromise. There's been instances of, I know with printers, of new network card going in that's full of memory that captures everything. And so you want to know what's going on. You want to monitor the hardware. Next thing you want to do is look at the firmware on a system. So when I talk about looking at the firmware, it's code on the board, and this could be anything from kind of the way it works is the bigger and more complex the device, the more room and more money the manufacturer is probably putting into some type of firmware level security. So if you look at a server, it might have a technology like Intel Trusted Execution Technology, which really does three things. You've probably heard about it. The first thing it does is features on the chip that when you power up the server, the first thing it does is prior to executing option ROMs and prior to executing the BIOS on a system, it actually takes a hash of that and it stores it in this trusted platform module. I happen to have one right here. A trusted platform module made in China for HP. And so it stores these measurements in the trusted platform module. The next thing it does the same thing for the BIOS. When you boot it up, prior to executing the core operating system kernel, whether it be VMware, whether it be Linux, or whatever, it takes a hash of that, it takes a measurement, stores it in this secure storage location. And then the other thing it does the same thing for the loadable kernel modules. And then it does it for, it allows you to actually write data in there. So you can do some interesting things with servers, like forensically tie virtual machines and containers to a piece of hardware for a particular period of time. So you look at the firmware, and trusted execution works on servers. Routing and switching manufacturers, they've been adding capabilities in over time, but they're just now starting to expose things. So if you look at Cisco, there's some commands you can connect into their routing and switching platforms. You can run commands, and they have anti-counterfeit technology as well as some measurement technology that'll give you measurements that you can actually connect to Cisco's website, compare them via API, and see what's going on. And as they're releasing more technology, they're starting to add more capabilities. The third thing you want to look at is you want to look at the configuration. A lot of people are familiar with STIGs and all that good stuff. We're looking at configuration to make sure that we're looking at the configuration to make sure things are normal when it comes to, we're looking at anything we can around firmware. So some of it is basic things like password encryption turned on. Some of it's more advanced, like there's this in Cisco routing and switching, if the translation look-aside buffer is set from read-only to read-write, then you might have an issue. So what we'll do is we'll see what's out there and then also have discussions with the different manufacturers and OEMs, like what can you give us, or how would we know that there is some type of issue at the firmware layer? So the final thing we look at are operational metrics. And we want to look at the power. We want to look at if a system boots and cycles outside of a system cycles outside of a change window. Why is that? So we've had customers, they'll say, hey, we've got these routers and switches out in the field that just kind of disappear offline for a week or a month, and then they just show back up. And so we want to know what's going on there. So we're looking at power. You want to look at power. You want to look at network traffic. You want to look at it could be a temperature reading. That could be the only indicator that something's going on at the firmware. So those are the 4 ways that you kind of start to assess the integrity of a device. So there, anyone have any questions so far? Comments? All right. I don't have tons and tons of material. So the next question that people have is, as me being a pessimistic security guy, is that's great, you're looking at firmware, what about hardware? So how do you detect if something's messed up, somebody's modified hardware? And you've seen different attacks where things are going through the supply chain, they get modified en route. There's some interesting research going on at the University of Florida where they actually dropped about $10 million in a hardware security research lab. And they're doing things like they have CAT scans, they have X-rays, they have delaminating tools, and what they're doing is they're working on how do I detect physical changes to hardware systems. So there's 2 projects that we're hoping to pull into our platform, because it's one thing to have a bunch of smart PhDs doing research. It's another thing to have something that an E5 operator out in the field can go actually use in production. So one of the things that's going on over there at UF is they have some imaging capabilities where they'll do X-rays, they'll do microscope level photography and imagery of a board, and actually auto-generate a bill of materials out of it, and then someone with an off-the-shelf camera out in the field can take a picture, they can open up a system, take a picture of the board, upload it, and the things they've been able to detect are counterfeit chips on boards. They've also been able to detect modifications, like you'll see in some cases a little wire going from one piece to another, and so they're able to detect things that you wouldn't normally detect with the human eye, for example. So that's one of the projects, and the idea is, we'd like to pull some of that research in and make it operational. The other interesting piece of research going on there is every system for the last 20 years has this thing called the JTAG, and it's a test capability. So they're doing something where you actually connect into the JTAG, and they run a power current through the board. They have it hooked up to these, and I'm not an electrical or mechanical engineer, so you can throw things if I'm saying incorrect terminology. They have these oscilloscopes where they're measuring. I think they're measuring the impedance of the power. They generate a key, and then what that does is any physical tampering, they can do a good job of detecting it. So there's add-on pieces where you can actually connect into the board. You can and obtain these measurements on an ongoing basis and detect physical tampering. And there's also capabilities, if you have access and are manufacturing higher up in the supply chain, you can have this added, and so you can detect hardware tampering. So there's, let's see. So those are the 2 types of actual hardware capabilities that are out there as far as detecting, modifying, tampering of physical systems. So we've got the firmware, and then we've got the hardware. So some of the challenges are, what are the manufacturers and OEMs doing? The bigger the device, the more likely the capability. When you think about small IoT things, there's so much pressure to keep costs low. The manufacturers aren't like, well, what can I do to secure this? And we've had to do things like, ideally, we get our data. You want to get data as out of band as possible, as secure as possible. So it could be some out of band management platform, or it could be as we've had to do things like screen scrape and any number of ways just to obtain data. But you're seeing a lot of movement. I think actually just this past week I saw some, I've seen some announcements from different people about the capabilities to have a TPM type device on smaller things. So it's moving fast. One of the problems with this is, so the time between capabilities and announcements, the Intel Trusted Execution stuff was announced in 2005. Yay, we've got this new chip level security technology. It wasn't until 2010 that if you had the Intel server that you only got from Intel, forget any of their other OEMs, and the right version of VMware, then you could turn on this trusted execution stuff and you could get some pre-execution measurements. It wasn't until 2012, 2013 that all of the other OEMs, the HP, IBM, Lenovo, Cisco, Dell, started actually implementing it so it was usable. And at that time, you still had to reboot a system like 4 times just to get it turned on. It was so complicated. So now it's much easier. It's now 2019, but I'd say it was 2016, 2017. So it was over 10 years from the time when this technology was announced till when it was, I would say, semi-useful to an end customer. So anytime you hear these announcements from companies like, oh, there's this new hardware XYZ technology, you really have to pay attention. Like, okay, that's great. That's great, but when can I use it? What is the shape of the data? So if you're looking at something like a server or router, that's going to give a lot different information than an IoT device. So those are some of the types of things. How do you pull that data in, and what do you do with it? I guess finally, what can you do if you're in a leadership role? It's just something to start general awareness, start being aware, start kind of leaning on, start talking to your procurement people. You're buying servers. Servers already have a lot of stuff on it, routers and switches, but as you're making these other purchases, what you want to do is have your procurement ask the vendors, hey guys, what are you doing about this firmware thing? How are you doing it? If you're in an audit or compliance role, I mentioned 853. The question, if you're going and talking to people or granting your ATO, say, hey guys, what are you doing about SI7? That's the only thing. If you remember one thing for your compliance, what are you doing there? The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, if you're on the medical side, at the end of last year, they kind of took all of the 853 requirements and dropped them into their acceptable risk standards. That happened in November. So we've been getting folks that are saying, hey, we went through an audit and we don't know what to do about this SI7 stuff. The other thing is understand your inventory. This goes back to incident response and just good security hygiene. I can't harp on this enough. I've been involved in 2 incidents in the last 6 months, and people don't know where stuff is. And so typically the system of record, if you ask a security guy, it's your vulnerability scanner. So how do you know what your stuff is? Well, Tenable or whatever tells us what's out there. So some systems replace because they can't be secure. As a security guy, I have a guttural reaction when people say, oh, you got to replace all your equipment. But there's some smart folks in the government. They're saying, hey, some of these vulnerabilities are so bad that you're going to have to replace equipment. And the Verizon data breach report came out, and being that we have a tool to do this stuff, I'm always hoping like they're going to say the world's falling and you must buy our tool. But it said they haven't seen anything in the wild about Spectre and Meltdown, and there was no mention from the data breach perspective of firmware stuff. My argument as a security guy, I'd say, look, I can wall this stuff off, I'll take it offline, but as you pay attention to this, just keep it in mind from a procurement perspective, like what systems are they saying can't be secured? And pay attention to that as you're thinking about your procurement strategy going forward. I mean, I'd love to say, yeah, replace everything that has cool security stuff. But, well, guys, that's really all I've got. I'm happy to have a discussion, answer questions or anything. I've been kicking around in this space. We got started in 2011 doing consulting for service providers based on the work I had previously done. And then we called our friends at Intel and said, hey, this hardware security stuff's kind of interesting. And we ended up developing a tool that took the Intel security features, kind of sent them all to the enterprise security reporting tools like your SIM, like McAfee. And then over the next 2 years, we kind of switched to software development and have a tool. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn for business stuff. If you're interested in goofy ultra running stuff that I do on the side, that's Instagram. And guys, that's all I got. Like I say, happy to take questions or anything here.